Chapter 1. The Broken Slave. The marketplace on Dravax had seen better days, or so the old traders said. Once a thriving hub of commerce that connected distant star systems and brought together the most rare and exotic goods from across the galaxy, it was now little more than a faded echo of its former self. As the sunless sky above flickered with sporadic flashes of distant solar winds, the stalls along the crowded, winding streets bore the weight of the marketplace's faded grandeur. The neon signs sputtered in the humid air, their garish lights illuminating the figures that haggled, sold, and bought in the perpetual cycle of this world's economy. Slaves, machines, weaponry, foodstuff, and other odds and ends that were just as alien to the native species of the planet as they were to the scattered traders and mercenaries who lingered at every corner. The aroma of alien meats roasting on skewers mixed with the burnt sugar scent of fuel from hovering transports and a sharp, metallic smell of rusted machinery. The market was alive in every way, but beneath its bustling surface, a more disturbing truth was hidden. Most of the goods sold here were not mere objects, but living, breathing being slaves, some of them unwilling, others so beaten down that they no longer had the strength to even protest. And it was in this cruel, unforgiving marketplace that she stood, the broken slave chained to the rusted iron post at the farthest edge of the market, just beyond the reach of the more reputable traders and under the watchful eyes of those who preyed on desperation. She was barely more than a shadow of herself, a thing to be bartered for a price too low to matter. Her name was unknown to the many who passed her by, their eyes flicking over her as though she were nothing more than a piece of merchandise. She was unlike the others in the market, unlike the sleek, well-kept slaves that were paraded around like prized possessions. She had been stripped of her dignity, her identity, and her purpose. She stood motionless, her pale, almost translucent skin a stark contrast against the dingy surroundings of the market stall. Her back was arched with the weight of unseen scars, the marks of countless lashings and tortures that were left to mar her body, but none could break the fierce glint in her eyes. Though she stood shackled, her gaze was unwavering, sharp with intelligence and untamed defiance, even if she no longer had the will to fight. She was a product, nothing more, her value no longer determined by her potential but by the sadistic whims of her owners, who had long since stripped her of any hope of ever seeing freedom again. As the day wore on, the market's atmosphere grew heavier, the laughter of traders cutting through the air as they bartered and haggled over the worth of the slaves that were brought before them. She could hear the low, guttural voices of the traders discussing her in hushed tones, their faces hidden beneath helmets or veils, giving nothing away but their greed. The whispers never seemed to stop, nor did the taunts that echoed in the air as they passed her by. She knew they were laughing at her broken state, at the way her body trembled beneath the weight of the shackles that held her, a silent reminder of the years of suffering she had endured. Her price had been set just 10 credits, a meager sum that would scarcely cover the cost of a meal in the more affluent sectors of Dravax 4. It was an insult, a joke, but she could do nothing. She could only stand there, an unwilling part of the marketplace's cruel game. Her eyes, once full of life and fire, were now dulled with exhaustion, the edges of her vision blurry from the long years of torment she had endured. The energy that once burned within her was gone, consumed by the endless cycle of pain and suffering. It was easier to just be silent, easier to blend into the background and wait for the day to pass, for the next buyer to come along and claim her as their property. Only 10 credits. One of the traders sneered as he appraised her from a distance, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Who would want this? She's broken, useless. The others gathered around, nodding in agreement, casting disparaging glances at her like she was some kind of defect, an item that was beyond repair. The voices of the market hummed in the background, and the heat of the desert planet began to press against her skin, the sweat collecting at the back of her neck as the oppressive sun rose higher. She felt the weight of her chains once more, the cold metal biting into her skin, but she did not flinch. She had long since lost the will to fight against it, to fight against the world that had forgotten her. The traders continued to laugh, and one of them made a low, mocking sound as he raised his hand, motioning for a nearby slave master to bring her closer. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the distance. The master, an overweight, greasy human with a permanent scowl, approached with a cruel smile painted on his face. "The market's ripe for a good deal today," the slave master said with a thick, grating voice, lifting her chin with a sharp motion. "She's not worth much, but a few credits is a few credits. Maybe someone will bite." Gregor Winsley had been observing the exchange from a distance, hidden among the crowd that had gathered in the more reputable section of the marketplace. A former mechanic from Earth, now a wanderer of the stars, he had arrived on Dravax 4 in search of work and had found himself drawn into the chaotic market by nothing more than the chance encounter with a message. An encrypted signal hidden in a forgotten corner of a starship's computer, one that led him here, to this planet, to this very moment. He had come for a job, but what he found instead was an entirely different kind of work. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes caught the broken slave, shackled and bruised, a piece of nothing in the cruel world of Dravax 4. He watched as the traitor laughed, the slave master with his calloused hands, and the way the broken woman seemed to shrink into herself under the weight of their words. Gregor didn't know why he felt drawn to her. There was something in the way her eyes flickered with life, even in such a bleak situation, that stirred something inside of him. Maybe it was the injustice of it all, or perhaps it was his own unspoken desire to right the wrongs of the galaxy. But Gregor couldn't stand by and do nothing. He couldn't let her be reduced to this. He stepped forward, breaking through the crowd, ignoring the sidelong glances and hushed murmurs that followed him as he approached the merchant. The slave master eyed him warily, then looked him over with a sneer, as if sizing up the newcomer to see what sort of deal he might be able to make. 10 credits, the merchant repeated, his voice thick with mockery. "The price is set, my friend. You can have her for 10 credits. She's broken, useless, not worth much." Gregor's gaze shifted to the broken woman, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. It was brief, but in that glance, he saw something, a spark, a flash of hope, no matter how dim, that told him she was more than what they were trying to sell. And that was all he needed. "I'll take her," Gregor said flatly, the words escaping his mouth without hesitation. The merchant's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "A fool, then. 10 credits. You'll regret it." Gregor ignored the comment, pulling a small pouch of credits from his belt and placing it in the merchant's hands. The deal was done, and just like that, the broken slave was his, though he knew the journey ahead was far from simple. She was worth more than 10 credits. She had to be. The trader took the pouch without a second glance, counting the credits quickly with his thick, stubby fingers. The woman remained silent, her eyes downcast, her body stiff with the weight of surrender. She had been bought, sold again, as though her life meant no more than a broken piece of machinery. But Gregor didn't see it that way. As he exchanged a few more glances with the slave master, he could see that the man had no interest in her beyond the money she could bring him. She was just another trade, another transaction in a long line of countless others. Gregor reached for the chain that bound her to the post, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The shackles that held her wrists were rusted and worn, evidence of years of use, of cruelty, of disregard. He could feel the weight of her history in that touch, the countless times she had been sold, beaten, abandoned. Yet, despite everything, there was something unspoken in the way she looked at him. It was a look that carried the burden of years, yet also a flicker of curiosity, of hope. Gregor gently unclipped the shackles, one by one, feeling the weight lift from her as the chains fell to the ground with a dull thud. The woman didn't move at first. She stood there, staring at her now free wrists as though she couldn't comprehend the sudden freedom, as though the very concept of it had become a foreign idea to her. But Gregor didn't rush her. He stood by silently, waiting, letting her process it on her own terms. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes were full of a guarded wariness, a look that betrayed the years of trauma she had endured. But there was something else there, something raw, something that told him she had not yet given up. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of soldiers who had fought too many battles, something that didn't want to believe in the possibility of peace, but desperately needed it. "I'm not going to hurt you," Gregor said softly, trying to reassure her, though he didn't know how much his words would matter. "You're free now. You're not anyone's property anymore." She didn't speak, but there was a slight nod of acknowledgement. It was the first time she had moved willingly, the first sign of a decision made not out of fear, but out of some faint glimmer of trust. And it was enough. Gregor turned his attention to the slave master, who had been observing the scene with a look of mild amusement. "She's free," Gregor said, his voice cold now, no longer willing to tolerate the market's cruel transactions. "You don't get to sell her anymore." The slave master chuckled, a deep, throaty sound that sent a chill through the air. "You think it's that easy? You think you've saved her? She's broken, my friend. There's nothing to save. She'll be just another deadweight soon enough. Another useless thing to throw away." Gregor stood tall, his stance unwavering. "Not this time. She's worth more than you could ever understand." With that, he turned away from the trader and led the woman toward the exit of the marketplace. The air felt different as they moved further from the stalls, no longer permeated by the stench of cruelty, but by the sharp scent of new beginnings. She walked beside him, still hesitant, but slowly finding her pace as the dust of the market faded behind them. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the bite of the chains, the lash of a whip, or the coldness of her owner's eyes. She felt something else, a vague hope, uncertain but alive. Chapter 2. The Price of Freedom. The city outside the market was not much different from the marketplace itself. Dravax 4 was a planet in decline, its streets crowded with scavengers, rogues, and the occasional lost traveler. The once prosperous cities had crumbled under the weight of corruption and greed, leaving only ruins and remnants of a forgotten age. The people here, much like the slaves in the market, had learned to survive by whatever means necessary. It was a harsh, unforgiving place. Gregor led the woman through the bustling streets, the noise and chaos of the city blending into a distant hum as they walked. He had no clear destination in mind. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, how to help her, or where she could go now that she was free. He couldn't take her back to Earth. It wasn't safe, not with the galaxy's underworld hunting for anything valuable. And he certainly didn't have the resources to set her up in any kind of permanent safety. "So," Gregor started, his voice tentative but sincere, "what do I call you?" The woman's steps faltered, as though the question had caught her off guard. She hadn't been asked her name in years, if she even remembered it. Her throat was tight, and her tongue felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She couldn't remember the last time she had spoken aloud. Her mind drifted for a moment to the distant past, to a time when she had been more than a slave, when she had been someone's daughter, someone's sister. But that life felt like a dream, a life she would never return to. I don't know," she replied quietly, her voice hoarse, as if unused to the sound of her own words. "I don't have a name." Gregor nodded slowly, not pushing her to elaborate, though he could hear the pain in her voice. "That's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to have one right now. You're free to choose whatever you want." She nodded, the smallest hint of relief crossing her face, though she didn't speak again. It was clear that there was more to her story than she was willing to reveal, but Gregor didn't press her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just a shared understanding that neither one of them needed to say more. They passed through the streets, dodging puddles of murky water and avoiding the eyes of suspicious strangers. Gregor had no real plan beyond finding shelter for the night. He didn't know where to go, but instinct told him he needed to get out of the city before it grew dark. The underworld of Dravax 4 wasn't known for its hospitality, especially for people like them. They stopped at a small, run-down and tucked away in a corner of the city, its faded sign swaying in the breeze. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Gregor paid the innkeeper in advance, taking a key to one of the rooms before turning to the woman. She looked around at the dingy surroundings, her expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what comes next," Gregor said, turning back to her. "But you're safe here for now." She looked up at him, the weight of everything finally settling on her shoulders. It had been so long since she had felt anything close to safety. Her eyes softened, though the wariness never fully left them. "I don't know where to go," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I don't know who I am anymore." "You'll figure it out," Gregor said, giving her a reassuring smile. "One step at a time." As the door closed behind them, a sense of something new began to take root. The journey ahead was uncertain, full of dangers, and without clear answers. But for the first time, the woman who had been nothing more than a commodity in the marketplace had been given a chance at something more, her own future. And for Gregor, the path forward was just as unclear. But one thing was certain, he couldn't leave her behind. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. The in-room was small, dimly lit by a flickering overhead light that hummed like a dying star. The walls were stained with age and neglect, the floorboards creaking underfoot with every step. Yet, to Gregor, it felt like a sanctuary. It was the first real break they had gotten since leaving the market, and he knew they needed time to rest. Time to think. The woman remained silent as she sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes vacant, staring at the chipped paint on the walls. Her fingers brushed over the thin fabric of the blanket, as though she were trying to feel something real again, something that wasn't tied to the years of pain, exploitation, and betrayal. She hadn't spoken much since they left the market. Her silence was a shield, one that she had erected to protect herself from the world. She had learned long ago that speaking too much meant revealing too much, and revealing too much meant vulnerability that her former owners would have exploited without hesitation. Gregor sat across from her, leaning against the rickety chair near the small window. He hadn't asked for her story. He wasn't sure if she was ready to share it yet. But he knew, deep down, that the truth would come out when she was ready. For now, all he could offer was his presence, his willingness to be there for her. That was all he could do. "I don't know where to go from here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, unsure. "I don't have a plan. I didn't expect any of this. But we can figure it out. Together." She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like hours. There was something raw in her eyes, a mixture of fear and uncertainty, but also something else, a glimmer of hope. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. "Together," she repeated softly, as though tasting the word. She blinked, her throat tight. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." Gregor nodded. "No, I don't. But I know you don't deserve to be treated like this. No one does." She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I was nothing before, nothing but a thing to be used. I was born for nothing more than to be a tool, a weapon, a slave." "No one is born to be a slave," Gregor said firmly. "No one." She seemed to take comfort in his words, even if she didn't entirely believe them. The weight of years of abuse and neglect didn't disappear overnight, and Gregor knew that healing wouldn't be quick or easy. But it had to start somewhere. "I don't even know what to do with freedom," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's been taken from me for so long. I don't know what I'm supposed to be now." Gregor sighed, standing and walking over to the small window. He could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the distant roar of transport ships in the sky. Dravax 4 was a place of broken dreams, but it was also a place where anything could happen. It was the perfect place to start over if only they had a direction. "You don't have to know right now," Gregor said, turning to face her. "You're not alone anymore. That's all I can offer you for now. You don't have to have it all figured out." She looked at him, something softer in her expression now. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but in that moment, she was willing to try. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear, something akin to peace, even if it was fleeting. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." "I didn't see you as a slave," Gregor replied with a smile. "I saw you as someone who needed help. And that's all." The silence returned between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect. They both knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But for the first time in years, the woman felt like she might have a chance to reclaim her life. And that was enough to give her hope. Chapter 3, A New Beginning. The morning arrived in the usual way, no fanfare, no signal that today would be any different from the last. The city of Dravax 4 stirred to life, its streets bustling with the usual crowd of scavengers, traders, and travelers. The day would pass like all the others, marked by the grind of survival. But for Gregor and the woman in the inn, today felt different. She stood by the window, looking out at the bustling street below, her face partially illuminated by the weak sunlight that filtered through the dusty glass. She had spent the entire night reflecting, sorting through the broken pieces of her past, trying to make sense of everything that had led her to this moment. For years, she had been nothing more than a slave property to be used, sold, and discarded. The very concept of freedom felt alien to her, like something reserved for other people. But now, she was standing on the precipice of something new. A new life, a new identity. The weight of it was both overwhelming and liberating. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked, her voice quiet, yet steady. "To start over? To leave everything behind and be someone else?" Gregor looked at her, his face thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we can try. No one's life is set in stone. We're all just trying to find our place. You don't have to know exactly what comes next. You just have to be willing to try." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was trapped in the cycle of her past. She could move forward. She could find her place in this world no longer defined by the shackles that had once bound her. Gregor placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "We'll figure it out. Together." The woman met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was the first real step she had taken toward freedom, and it was a step she had taken not alone, but with someone who had seen her for who she truly was. As they stepped out into the busy streets of HFY 4, they didn't know where the path ahead would lead. But they both knew one thing: they were no longer alone. And that made all the difference. The streets of HFY 4 had a pulse to them, a rhythm of their own that seemed to echo through the worn-out buildings and dusty roads. The crowd was always on the move, always looking for something, whether it was food, shelter, or something more valuable. But for Gregor and the woman, the chaos of the marketplace no longer held the same weight. They weren't there to barter or bargain. They were there to escape, to carve out a space for themselves in a galaxy that had long forgotten the value of compassion. Gregor led her down narrow alleys and through shadowed corners, avoiding the prying eyes of the traders and underworld figures that seemed to populate every street. It wasn't that he feared them, it was simply that they weren't in a hurry to be noticed. His eyes scanned their surroundings, always alert, but never anxious. The woman walked beside him, her strides now more confident than the night before. She was no longer the broken slave chained to a post, her movements slow and deliberate. She had found her voice again, if only in the smallest of ways. Her back was straighter, her gaze sharper. She didn't know where she was going yet, but that was part of the beauty of freedom. The road ahead was theirs to choose. They eventually found themselves standing before a rundown warehouse at the edge of the city. It wasn't much to look at, a decaying building on the outskirts of town, hidden away from the bustling heart of the marketplace. But to Gregor, it represented possibility. It wasn't much, but it could be the fresh start they needed. "This will work," Gregor said, his voice low but hopeful. "We can stay here for now. It's far enough from the market that we should be safe, at least for a while." The woman looked up at the building, taking in the faded walls and rusted metal doors. It wasn't pretty, but it was hers. It was theirs. A place where they could rest, recover, and maybe, just maybe, begin to build something better. She nodded, though her eyes were filled with doubt. She hadn't imagined freedom like this, no grand gestures, no sweeping rescue. But maybe that was the point. Maybe freedom wasn't about grand moments or epic battles. Maybe it was just about taking the first step, no matter how small. They entered the warehouse, finding a small, empty space in the back. It wasn't much: a few crates, a small cot, and a single window that looked out onto the empty expanse of the city. The air smelled of dust and old metal, but it felt like home, in its own strange way. For the first time in a long while, the woman let her guard down. She sank onto the cot, her body finally allowing itself to relax. Her fingers trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the realization that, for the first time, she wasn't under the thumb of another person. She was free. Gregor stood by the window, watching the busy streets below. His mind raced with questions about what they would do next, where they would go, how they would survive. But all of that could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that they had a place to call their own. "I don't know what comes next," Gregor said softly, his back still to her. "But we'll face it together." The woman looked at him, her eyes softening. She hadn't expected kindness, not like this. It had been so long since anyone had treated her with respect, since anyone had seen her as more than a commodity to be used and discarded. She had learned to survive by shutting down, by becoming invisible, by giving nothing of herself. But Gregor had given her something that she hadn't thought possible, a chance to be human again. "I don't know either," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "But I think I'm ready to try." Chapter 4. The True Worth of a Person. The days that followed were a blur of small, careful steps. Gregor and the woman spent their time building something together, no grand dreams or plans, just the simple act of surviving. They found food, kept to the shadows, and learned to trust each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And slowly, as the days passed, the woman began to rediscover herself. She wasn't the broken slave anymore. She was someone new, someone with choices, with control, with the ability to determine her own future. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the memories of her past would creep up on her, threatening to consume her. The cruelty of her past life, the way she had been used, discarded, and forgotten, it all haunted her. But Gregor was there. He didn't push her to forget. He didn't demand that she move on immediately. He simply let her be, offering her a steady hand when she needed it. He allowed her to heal at her own pace, without judgment. But there were also moments of joy. When they sat together to eat, when they talked about the future, however uncertain it was, it felt like a new beginning. The woman had found something she hadn't thought possible: hope. And it wasn't just the hope of freedom, it was the hope of living a life that was truly her own. One afternoon, after a long day of scrounging for supplies, Gregor and the woman sat outside their makeshift home, watching the city's skyline as the twin suns set in the distance. The sky shifted from a harsh yellow to a soft purple, casting a calm light over the streets. "Do you ever miss it?" Gregor asked, looking over at the woman. "Your old life, I mean." The question hung in the air between them. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting the breeze wash over her. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't think I've ever really had a life. I was never allowed to have one." Gregor didn't respond, but he didn't need to. He understood. He had seen what the market had done to her, how it had stripped away everything that made her human. But now, sitting beside her, in this quiet corner of Dravax 4, he realized something. She had never been worthless. She had never been broken. It wasn't the price she had been sold for that defined her. It was the strength she had carried inside her, the fire that had never been fully extinguished. The market had laughed at her price, only 10 credits for a broken slave, but Gregor knew her true worth now. She was worth more than all the credits in the galaxy. She was worth the chance to rebuild, to rediscover who she was, and to choose her own path. And that was worth everything. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Gregor stood and offered his hand to her. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw not a broken slave, but a woman who was free to be anything she chose. "I think it's time we start living, don't you?" Gregor said, his voice warm with the promise of a new beginning. The woman smiled, the first real smile she had given in years. "Yes," she said softly. "Let's live." And together, they walked into the future, not as strangers to each other, but as equals, two souls who had found their way to freedom, and in doing so, had found something even more precious: their own worth.